Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going into a story that, it completely captivated the entire world. It's a narrative that shifted so violently from global inspiration to absolute tragedy.
Right.
The life and trial of Oscar Pistorius. We've compiled a huge stack of source material, articles, research, transcripts that really force you to look beyond the headlines.
It's a profound case study, really, in the human condition. And what makes these sources so vital is that they compel us to explore the internal psychological elements.
Yes.
We're trying to move past the legal finality to understand the huge forces at play, this pursuit of ultimate triumph, the paralyzing internal fear, and then the devastating consequences when those two things just collide.
That's precisely it. Our mission today is very clear.
Yeah.
We are explicitly not here to relitigate the legal outcome. That process wrapped up years ago.
Right. That's done.
Our goal is to extract the key psychological insights, the narrative insights that are in this material. We're focusing on the clash between the man who is held up as this global symbol and the private, deep-seated fear that the sources argue was just simmering beneath the surface.
And what's immediately compelling when you go through these documents is the sheer kind of whiplash speed of that narrative shift. The story starts as this modern miracle of human achievement, resilience that seemed almost superhuman, and then bam, it transitions into an incident driven entirely by panic, by vulnerability, and this profound perceived powerlessness.
Two completely different people.
Exactly. The source materials essentially lay out two competing, almost irreconcilable narratives. The flawless armored hero versus the haunted man. And our job is to unpack the evidence for both, impartially.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we can even get to that fateful night, we have to start with the foundations, the pressure points, the incredible but also really complicated origins of his life. How did he become the symbol we all thought we knew?
To understand the collapse, you have to meticulously examine the foundation upon which he built his entire identity.
The documentation takes us right back to the very beginning.
Mm.
It establishes that Oscar Pistorius's life was, from moment one, defined by difference. He was born without his lower legs, a congenital condition.
Right.
And here's the detail that the reports really emphasize. Before he was old enough to even form memories, at just 11 months old, doctors performed a bilateral amputation below the knee.
And that is an intensely formative detail. Its psychological significance, you just can't overstate it. The sources highlight that he never knew what it felt like to have natural legs.
Never.
His whole sense of balance, mobility, his identity, his relationship with the world was instantly defined by adaptation, by using mechanical extensions, prosthetics. There was no memory of wholeness to fall back on.
He was, in a way, fundamentally incomplete, but forced to operate in a world that wasn't.
Exactly. And this physically unique beginning was then coupled with this incredibly rigorous, you might even say brutal, style of upbringing.
Driven by his mother, right? The research suggests she took these very proactive steps to make sure he was never, ever treated with pity or seen as disabled.
Absolutely. The sources really drill down on his mother's single, uncompromising mandate: never show weakness, ever.
Wow.
And this wasn't just, a suggestion. It was, according to people close to the family, a foundational emotional rule. She reportedly encouraged him and his siblings to see challenges not as limitations, but as enemies to be conquered.
But how did that intense pressure actually manifest? Did the sources give examples of how this constant state of fighting played out? Because just saying never show weakness sounds noble on the surface, but it must have come with a huge psychological cost.
It did, a huge cost. The sources give anecdotes detailing this almost pathological refusal to admit pain or fatigue or any kind of difficulty.
Like what?
For instance, in school sports, if he fell while running on his more rudimentary prosthetics back then, he would force himself up instantly, refusing to cry, refusing to acknowledge the pain, the embarrassment, and trainers later noted that this rigidity, it just carried right into his adult athletic career. He'd often hide minor injuries or push through discomfort that would sideline other elite athletes. All of it driven by that ingrained fear that revealing any vulnerability would just confirm the world's perception of his weakness.
So that means this upbringing wasn't just about fostering strength. It was about building an internal mechanism of deep, deep repression. You couldn't just be strong. You had to appear strong all the time, no matter how you actually felt inside.
Precisely. It turned life into a constant, exhausting battlefield. You're fighting against your own internal doubt, and you're fighting against external scrutiny.
And the sources say this was a double-edged sword. Right?
Absolutely. It gave him the mental toughness he needed to achieve greatness, but at the same time, it created this deep, fragile crack in his psychological structure. He never learned how to just be vulnerable or to accept help without feeling like he had failed.
And this defiance, this absolute refusal to accept limitation, that's what became the fuel for his rise. The source material details how adopting those sophisticated carbon blade prosthetics, the cheetah blades, it transformed him from just a determined athlete into a global phenomenon.
Those blades weren't just equipment, they were an extension of that mandate of defiance. They allowed him to become one of the fastest Paralympic athletes in the world. But of course, the story didn't stop there.
No.
The sources really emphasize his integration into able-bodied competition. I mean, ultimately culminating in the Olympics.
And the world's embrace of him was just total. Sponsors were lining up. He was a media darling.
Yeah.
He wasn't just celebrated for his speed. He was elevated to this symbolic status way beyond sports. He became this avatar for human potential.
Yeah.
The sources call him the guy who beat disability, the inspiration, the walking miracle.
And that label, while it brings immense glory, it carries an almost intolerable superhuman burden.
How so?
The world wasn't just applauding his athleticism. The world was demanding perpetual strength from him. Perfect resilience, absolute infallibility. He was required to be this perfect projection of control, which means any display of human frailty was a potential betrayal of the symbol he represented.
So if we look at that foundation, the mandatory strength, the constant fighting, the pressure of global infallibility, how does this psychological framework set the stage for what comes later? What's the inevitable consequence of relying so heavily on external control?
This is the critical psychological junction. What you just laid out shows that Oscar constructed this incredibly powerful but rigid external armor, forged by necessity, by public expectation.
Right.
The problem, as the psychological profiles in the sources suggest, is that to maintain this perfect outward appearance, he had to intensely repress all his internal vulnerability. If your entire identity is defined by strength, then any internal weakness becomes an existential threat.
Which leads to the big question.
Exactly. What happens when that external armor is momentarily removed, or when that intense need for absolute control is fundamentally challenged? The sources show the stage was set for a disaster fueled by a lifetime of emotional suppression.
And that transition brings us directly to the second pivotal section of the source material.
Yeah.
This deep, permanent conflict between the symbol the world saw and the fearful, vulnerable man hiding underneath.
We have to shift our focus now completely from the bright stadium lights to the solitude and the darkness of his internal life.
The sources reveal a profound paradox here. Behind the veneer of global perfection, the documents explicitly state that Oscar carried a permanent fear. And this wasn't just, the typical stress of fame. It was a fundamental, persistent state of mind that just shadowed everything he did.
And the research is very specific about how this fear manifested. It was multifaceted, but the core anxieties were the fear of losing control, which, ties right back to that maternal mandate.
Right.
The fear of external danger, and maybe most definingly, the absolute paralyzing fear of being physically powerless. This internal landscape is in direct, agonizing contradiction to the image of the invincible athlete he projected every single day.
It's the ultimate irony, isn't it? The man who literally conquered physical limits and achieved worldwide fame through his strength was at the same time internally defined by this profound, inescapable sense of powerlessness, especially when he was physically at his most vulnerable.
And crucially, this internal state was constantly validated, and so it was amplified by his external environment in South Africa.
That's a huge piece of this.
The sources repeatedly contextualize this narrative, noting that in a country where crime stories are part of everyday life, this fear felt not just psychological, but deeply real and tangible. High-profile break-ins, home invasions, violence, these weren't abstract threats. They were daily realities that provided a powerful, rational justification for hypervigilance and, paranoia.
That context is so essential because it moves the discussion beyond simple anxiety and into what to him felt like rational preparation for survival, which leads us directly to his relationship with firearms.
Right.
The sources are careful with the language here, stating he started loving guns a bit too much.
And that phrasing is highly suggestive. It moves beyond standard self-defense to imply a psychological reliance, maybe even an unhealthy obsession.
Why, though? What did the guns give him?
For Pistorius, firearms provided the perfect, instantaneous antidote to his internalized powerlessness. If his physical reality being without his prosthetics made him acutely vulnerable, the ability to wield absolute, immediate power through a weapon provided the emotional counterweight he desperately craved. It restored the control he constantly felt was slipping away.
So the gun became a kind of emotional prosthetic, an extension of his psychological armor.
That's a perfect way to put it. The sources elaborate on his level of preparedness, describing frequent visits to the shooting range, having multiple weapons strategically located throughout his home.
He was always prepared. That's how he saw it.
Exactly. The sources note that he viewed this constant readiness not as paranoia, but as a rational, logical necessity given his physical disadvantage and the environment. But this state of constant readiness, it creates a psychological condition where the default response to any ambiguity is confrontation, not caution, not retreat. He was primed to neutralize threats.
The sources, therefore, they really define this stage as the convergence of internal trauma and lethal means. You've got extreme vulnerability, deeply ingrained psychological trauma, the fear of being weak, the fear of powerlessness, paired with the means of extreme instantaneous power.
Guns, weapons.
The stage is set for tragedy. This combination fear meets power creates a hair-trigger response system. When your internal defense mechanism is constantly set to high alert and the available tool for defense is a lethal weapon, the margin for error is simply erased. Any ambiguous noise, any unexpected movement becomes a catastrophic trigger. And it is into this fragile, highly controlled, and heavily armed internal environment that Riva Steenkamp enters. Which brings us to the next chapter, detailing their relationship and the inherent cracks that began to appear almost immediately.
The sources introduce Riva Steenkamp as a model and a law graduate. She's described as beautiful, smart, and notably independent.
And there's a crucial detail there that's emphasized in the documents.
Yeah.
She was not the type to stay quiet.
That single attribute right there, it immediately signifies an element of inherent friction. Her independence, her willingness to articulate her feelings, it stands in stark opposition to a partner like Oscar, whose entire identity, public and private, was built around control and the repression of uncomfortable truths.
Initially, of course, the public only saw the perfect couple vibes.
Of course.
They're glamorous, high-profile, seemingly untouchable, the picture of celebrity success. But the source material, it very quickly moves past that facade to detail the reality underneath.
The documentation points to the slow emergence of significant cracks, and they appeared specifically because Oscar's internal conflict was manifesting as this crushing external need for dominance. The fear of losing control over his own life translated directly into an attempt to control the person closest to him.
We see a pattern detailed in their communication records, don't we? Extreme jealousy, this overly protective behavior that really bordered on monitoring, and just deep-seated suspicion.
Yeah, the specific behaviors cited in the sources, always wanting to know her exact location, demanding to know who she was talking to, getting angry if her replies were delayed, these are classic indicators of controlling behavior. It's all driven by insecurity and the fear of abandonment.
And since Riva was explicitly noted as being not the type to be controlled, the sources indicate this led to significant and frequent tension.
Her independence actively challenged the very control structure that Oscar needed to maintain his psychological equilibrium. Every act of autonomy on her part likely registered internally for him as a direct threat to his carefully constructed sense of dominance.
The most revealing and maybe the most chilling details about their dynamic come from those text messages, the ones that were later retrieved and read aloud in court.
Yes. Those messages confirm that she sometimes felt genuinely scared of his temper.
And the sources make a really critical distinction about the nature of that fear.
Yeah.
She wasn't afraid of physical violence in the traditional sense. She wasn't afraid of fists. So what was the core of her terror?
The terror was deeply psychological. She expressed fear of that switch.
That switch.
That's her phrase. The feeling that suddenly the room wasn't safe anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That phrase just powerfully encapsulates the unpredictable, sudden emotional volatility that the sources documented. It describes a near instantaneous transition where the charming partner would disappear, replaced by a volatile, irrational man.
And that's likely tied to moments when his rigid control system failed.
And his repressed vulnerability just erupted as rage.
Yes. It speaks volumes about the danger of extreme emotional instability paired with an inability to manage conflict constructively. When his control mechanisms broke down, the sources suggest the environment itself became hostile. And Riva, in her own words, recognize that fundamental, terrifying instability.
And this deepens the context of what happens next significantly. The events of that night were not isolated. They were the apex of a long-standing toxic dynamic where underlying fear, Oscar's fear of powerlessness, translated into the destructive need for control, which Riva instinctively and rightfully resisted.
So the sources bring us quickly to Valentine's week. Riva chose to spend the night at Oscar's heavily secured home. It's theorized this visit was an attempt to uh, fix things or maybe to reconnect.
An attempt to diffuse the growing tension. A desperate final attempt at normalcy that brought them both to the exact location where all these pressure points would catastrophically converge.
And that convergence point is the night itself, where the lifetime of vulnerability, the control issues, the ingrained fear, and the proximity to lethal power suddenly manifest as irreversible action.
The sources meticulously reconstruct the setting. It's the pre-dawn hours, well past 3 a.m. The house is quiet, secured, dark. And now we have to focus on the absolutely crucial detail that the sources stress repeatedly. The detail the defense built its entire case on.
Which is that Oscar is in bed without his prosthetic legs.
We need to spend a moment here. The source material is adamant that this detail is foundational to understanding his internal state at that specific moment. Without the carbon blade prosthetics, the technological armor that made him the symbol, he was reduced to a stump walking state.
The sources note he always felt the most exposed and vulnerable in this state.
He was, quite literally and metaphorically, stripped of the physical power and identity he had spent his entire life constructing.
Right. Physically, the reports indicate he was extremely unsteady, unbalanced, couldn't move quickly or defend himself effectively. And psychologically, this state reportedly plunged him back into the deepest well of his powerlessness, the very state his mother forbade him to ever inhabit, the state he fought his whole life to overcome.
Then comes the normal moment that the sources emphasize. Riva goes to the bathroom and closes the door. A simple, everyday action, a small, temporary separation.
But inside Oscar's hyper-vigilant, fear-laden mind, it becomes the ignition point for disaster.
The silence is violently shattered, not by a confirmed threat, but by a noise. He hears something, a noise, a movement.
The sources underline the ambiguity of it.
Absolutely. It didn't need to be a clear, identifiable threat. It just needed to be a catalyst that ignited that pre-existing, permanent, and suppressed fear of a home invasion.
And the reaction is overwhelming and instantaneous. The documentation suggests the fear switch flips.
This is the moment. This is where decades of psychological conditioning, the mother's rigid instruction, the suppressed sense of weakness, the context of real South African danger, and his acute physical vulnerability, it all violently collides. The capacity for rational thought, for checking the facts, it completely vanishes.
The core dispute of the entire trial centers on this critical juncture. Oscar's claim, repeated consistently in the sources, is that he was convinced a burglar had broken in.
Right.
That he perceived immediate lethal danger right there behind that closed door, and that he reacted out of absolute paralyzing panic.
And his subsequent actions are a textbook example of the dangerous combination we identified earlier. Extreme internal fear meeting the instant availability of extreme power. He grabs his gun, he moves toward the source of the noise, the bathroom, and the sources confirm he was unsteady and low to the ground without his legs.
And here is the fatal omission. The act of non-communication that the prosecution later leveraged so heavily, he fires instead of calling Riva's name.
Or checking to see where she was.
Or even just issuing a verbal warning. The protocol of panic completely overrides the connection to the person he supposedly loved, who he knew was also in the house.
The action itself, captured in the source evidence, is horrifying in its totality. He fires. Once, then immediately, twice, 3 times, 4, all through a closed, thin door.
The sources detail the relentless nature of that response. 4 shots, fired in quick succession. It speaks not just to a startled reaction, but to a total discharge of power aimed at neutralizing a perceived, unseen, life-threatening danger. It's the complete surrender to terror.
And then the silence. The abrupt absence of sound following the gunfire followed, as the sources grimly describe it, by the slap of reality.
The sudden realization that the noise was gone, the threat was neutralized, and the panic was receding, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the smell of gunpowder.
The sources describe the immediate aftermath as this rapid succession of desperate, agonizing actions, a frantic attempt to undo the irreversible. He doesn't go to the phone, he goes to the door. He tries to get in, he breaks the door with a cricket bat.
That detail itself speaks to the intense physical panic and desperation to get into that room.
And then, the discovery that shatters his world. It wasn't an anonymous intruder, it was Riva, shot, bleeding, and tragically not moving. The reports of the scene detail the absolute devastation of that moment.
The perfect symbol of strength completely shatters.
Completely. The sources detail the chaos that followed, his desperate phone calls for help, his primal screams, his crying. But the bleak conclusion drawn from the evidence is that this agonizing display of grief was already too late.
Valentine's Day had arrived, but Riva's life had already ended in the darkness.
And that moment marks the terminal end of the public myth and the beginning of the legal nightmare. The tragedy drew immediate global attention, marking the transition from the private tragedy inside that house to the public spectacle of the courtroom.
Police arrived quickly, securing a chaotic scene. The media explosion was instantaneous. The same machine that had built him up as the world's most hopeful hero immediately pivoted, transforming him into the suspect. The global narrative just violently and irrevocably shifted.
And the courtroom became the battleground for that definitive clash of the two narratives we've been tracing. Was this reckless violence driven by motive and volatility, or was it a tragic, panic-driven accident fueled by lifelong fear?
The prosecution's approach, as detailed in the source materials, was systematic. It was laser-focused on establishing intent, or at the very least, extreme recklessness. They knew they had to dismantle the highly sympathetic defense of panic and vulnerability.
Right.
So what are the specific pillars of their core argument? They had to prove that the man who fired those shots was not the terrified invalid, but the controlling partner prone to explosive rage.
The prosecution really built their case on 4 key pillars that stand out in the transcripts. First, they argued he was inherently reckless. He fired a high-powered weapon 4 times without confirming his target or the nature of the threat. That's a crucial element in common law regarding negligence and intent.
Okay.
Second, they maintained he knew, or he should have known, that someone, specifically Riva, was behind that door based on the timing and their familiarity with the house.
And their third point focused on the sheer number of rounds fired. That was devastating, wasn't it?
Absolutely. 4 shots, they argued, demonstrated intent. It suggested a conscious decision to eradicate a threat, regardless of who that threat was. They argued that a single startled reaction might explain 1 shot, but 4 shots implied sustained lethal action.
And finally, they provided the motive.
Yes. His documented temper, his volatility, his jealousy, which was explicitly evidenced in those relationship texts we talked about. They painted a picture of a man who needed control and who reacted violently when he felt that control slipping away.
So the prosecution was painting a portrait not of a terrified victim of circumstance, but of an unstable, controlling individual whose volatility, amplified by a firearm, led to a complete and reckless disregard for human life.
And you contrast that sharply with the defense's argument, which was fundamentally rooted in his lifelong trauma. They lean heavily on the psychological profile of extreme fear.
Right.
Their argument was that he was genuinely terrified. An emotional and physical reality made so much worse by his vulnerability without his legs. They argued that given the genuine high crime rate in South Africa, his belief that it was an intruder was credible.
Their core summation was just, this was a tragic, albeit disastrous accident.
Fueled by genuine existential panic.
And the sources emphasize the immense human drama of the trial itself. Oscar's visible displays of distress, the public crying, the shaking, the frequent breakdowns, they were constants throughout the proceedings. They almost became a piece of evidence in themselves.
And that intense emotional performance became the focus of intense scrutiny. It just illustrates the impossibility of separating the man's actions from the narrative surrounding him.
Right.
The sources state that many observers, including experts, were deeply polarized. Some saw raw, genuine remorse and the trauma of realizing what he'd done. Others saw it as calculated acting, a cynical strategy by the defense to elicit pity from the judge and the public.
Beyond the raw emotion, the forensic and anecdotal evidence played a critical role in piecing together the timeline. Let's delve into the details the sources provide on that physical evidence.
First, those text messages were crucial. Reading Riva's own words, her expressions of fear and discomfort aloud in court provided vital insight into the relationship's dynamic. It gave credence to the prosecution's motive argument. Second, the detailed forensic analysis of the bullet trajectories, charting their path through the door and into Riva, was used to challenge aspects of the defense's story about his position and height when he fired. It suggested a more calculated firing position than just simple, startled confusion.
And the neighbor testimony also complicated the defense's narrative about a silent intruder, didn't it?
Yes, profoundly. The sources indicate that neighbors testified to hearing screams Specifically, a woman's screams before the shots were fired. Before. Then silence, and then more desperate screaming from a male voice. This testimony introduced the devastating possibility that there had been a conscious confrontation or an argument preceding the shooting. That directly contradicts the defense's claim that Oscar awoke in silence, heard a noise, and panicked instantly without any confrontation.
So as the court weighed all this conflicting, highly emotional and complex evidence, the text showing rage, the neighbors suggesting a pre-shooting incident, and the undeniable terror of the shooting itself, the sources conclude that slowly through this process, the picture becomes darker.
The accumulation of detail forced the court and the public to confront the uncomfortable reality that this was not a simple, clean case of pure evil or pure accident. It was a chaotic, toxic intersection of psychological trauma, relationship volatility, and the availability of overwhelming lethal force.
Which brings us to the evolution of the legal outcomes, the final, definitive consequences, and the resulting life after glory.
The legal journey was itself highly unstable, which really reflects the complexity and ambiguity of the psychological evidence. The sources detailed the initial conviction, culpable homicide.
That's the South African equivalent of manslaughter, correct?
Exactly. The initial court found recklessness, meaning he acted negligently and should have foreseen the danger, but not that he had the premeditated intent to murder.
But as you mentioned, that was not the final word. And this is where the legal distinction becomes so important for you to understand. The sources confirm that later, on appeal, that initial finding was successfully challenged.
It was. The appellate court intervened, and they focused on a crucial legal principle known as dolus eventualis.
Did you break that down?
Yes. Culpable homicide implies he should have known the risk. Dolus eventualis, however, implies that he did foresee the possibility of death resulting from his actions, firing 4 high-powered rounds through a small closed door. And despite that foresight, he proceeded anyway, essentially reconciling himself with the fatal outcome.
So the key distinction is that the appeal court essentially ruled that even if he genuinely believed the person behind the door was an intruder, the act of firing 4 times meant he accepted the risk that whoever was there might die.
Right.
And that degree of foresight and acceptance elevated the crime from culpable homicide to murder.
That's the crux of the shift. It was a determination that his actions were reckless enough to be deemed murderous intent, regardless of the victim's identity. And with that change came the definitive, absolute reality shift.
The inspiration poster boy, the global icon, was suddenly transformed into inmate number X.
The sources emphasize the fall from grace was immediate, absolute, and terminal. The documents vividly contrast the 2 realities of his life.
Yeah.
Prison is the antithesis of the stadium. There is no cheering, there are no cameras documenting his triumph, and there is no escape.
Just concrete walls, time stretching out, and the inescapable haunting memory of that one night, which he now must confront without the public defense of the hero narrative.
And the enduring cost, of course, it radiates far beyond his prison cell. The sources remind us that Riva's family is left to live with the perpetual silence and the hole left by her absence. The documents explicitly state, there is no version of this story where they heal completely.
Their tragedy is perpetual, the resolution unattainable.
Yes. And Oscar's eventual outcome, as detailed in the source materials after his parole was granted, provides a final, desolate note. He doesn't return to celebrity or even to a quiet, normal life.
No.
The sources starkly describe his return to nothing, a life forever tied to one night. His fame is now toxic. His identity is irrevocably tainted by the consequences of his actions.
It's the ultimate tragic summary, distilled from all the evidence. 4 shots, fired through one door, ending the life of one woman who never came back out.
The sources compel us to view this tragedy not just as a legal proceeding, but as a chilling cautionary tale. A tale about the lethal interaction between deep-seated, untreated psychological trauma and the catastrophic potential of instant, overwhelming power.
We've covered an immense amount of intensely detailed and emotionally complex ground today. And to synthesize the core threads that are emphasized across all the source materials, this story resists a simple conclusion.
It does.
It isn't about simply defining Oscar Pistorius as a monster or a purely innocent victim of bad luck. It is fundamentally about the lethal interaction of deep-seated fear and unchecked power, and the devastating, irreversible consequences that erupt when panic completely overtakes rational thought and emotional regulation.
And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, the sources suggest that the scariest part of this entire narrative is the location of the danger. The risk wasn't necessarily the external threat. The burglar he constantly feared was lurking outside his house.
Hmm.
The true danger, according to the psychological analysis, was inside someone's head. The fragility of internal control, the consequence of hiding profound vulnerability under layers of forced strength, and the mechanism that translated internal terror into external lethal action.
It's a sobering perspective on what happens when that decades-long psychological armor finally cracks under the strain of vulnerability and a perceived threat. It really makes you reflect on the necessity of acknowledging, rather than just repressing, human fear.
It forces us to acknowledge that everyone carries psychological weight, but when that weight is a permanent fear, amplified by a mandate for absolute strength and access to the means of ultimate defense, the margin for error collapses to zero.
The consequence of one moment of panic collapse is the entire destruction of two lives.
A deeply complex and deeply sad story.
It is. Thank you for guiding us through the layers of the source material. We will leave you with a compelling final thought provided in the documentation, something for you to reflect on as you consider this tragic narrative and the power of internal forces. Oscar Pistorius ran his whole life, but on that one night, fear ran faster.